The weight of the past. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Paul's Church, casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the polished wooden pews. Pastor Daniel Hayes stood at the pulpit, gripping the worn leather Bible that had been his constant companion for over 2 decades. His deep voice resonated through the sanctuary as he spoke about redemption, about second chances, about the power of forgiveness. Yet every word felt like ash in his mouth. How could he speak of redemption when his past was filled with regret? How could he preach forgiveness when he had never been able to forgive himself? The congregation hung on his words, nodding in agreement, murmuring soft amens as he read from the book of Matthew. For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. Daniel's fingers tightened around the edges of the Bible. If only it were that simple. If only he could erase the past with a whispered prayer. As the service ended, the usual crowd of well-wishers lined up to shake his hand. "Beautiful sermon, Pastor," said Mrs. Calloway, an elderly woman with silver hair pinned in a tight bun. "Just what I needed to hear today." Daniel forced a smile, nodding politely. "I'm glad it brought you comfort, Mrs. Calloway." One by one, they filed past, each offering their praise, their trust in him unwavering. If they only knew. If they knew about the daughter he had turned away all those years ago, the child he had abandoned for the sake of his reputation, would they still look at him with such admiration? Would they still believe in his words if they knew the man speaking them had failed the person who needed him most? His heart clenched as he thought of her. Sarah. Her name had become a ghost that haunted him, whispered in the silence of his empty house, echoed in his dreams where she still stood before him, pleading for him to listen. He never had. Now it was too late. The weight of that regret settled heavily on his chest as he stepped out of the church, the cool autumn air brushing against his skin. He walked toward his old pickup truck, parked beside the large oak tree in the lot. Every Sunday, he followed the same routine: service, handshakes, pleasantries, before making his way to St. Vincent's Orphanage to deliver the church's monthly donation. It was the one thing that helped him feel like he was making a difference, even in a small way. He had been visiting the orphanage for nearly 15 years, always bringing donations, always offering a kind word to the children, but never staying long. He never allowed himself to get attached, never allowed himself to feel. That was until the day a little girl grabbed his hand, and his world shattered. The orphanage stood at the edge of town, a modest brick building with a rusted gate and a playground in need of repair. The mural on the front wall, painted years ago by volunteers, was faded, its colors dulled by time. It depicted a bright sun, rolling green hills, and children holding hands. But even the cheerful painting couldn't mask the truth. This was a place for children who had been left behind. Daniel parked his truck in the small lot and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. He adjusted his collar, grabbing the envelope containing the church's donation before making his way inside. The scent of industrial cleaner mixed with the faint aroma of crayons and chalk greeted him as he stepped through the doors. The front desk was manned by Margaret Lewis, the orphanage director, a woman with graying hair and warm brown eyes. She looked up from her paperwork and smiled. "Pastor Hayes, right on time as always," she said, standing to shake his hand. Daniel nodded. "I wouldn't miss it." Margaret accepted the envelope with a grateful nod, flipping through the check inside. "The church has been so generous. We're using this donation to fix up the library. The kids will be thrilled." "I'm glad to hear it," Daniel replied, his tone even, rehearsed. This was how their conversations always went. Pleasant, professional, safe. "I'd offer you a tour, but I know how busy you are," Margaret said, already moving to put the donation away. Daniel gave his usual polite smile. "Maybe another time." That was his routine. Drop off the check, say a few kind words, leave. But today was different. Today, as he turned to go, small fingers wrapped around his hand. His breath hitched. The grip was tight, desperate. He looked down into a pair of familiar brown eyes. eyes that made his world tilt sideways. "Please, adopt me." The words were barely more than a whisper, but they might as well have been a gunshot. Daniel's lungs refused to work. His throat went dry. The little girl staring up at him had dark brown hair, slightly messy as if she had been running moments before. She was thin, too thin, her purple sweater hanging loosely on her small frame. But it was her eyes that held him captive. Sarah's eyes. The same deep brown, the same tiny flecks of gold near the pupils. Daniel's knees nearly buckled. It wasn't possible. The world spun around him as his heart pounded violently against his ribs. "Emma." Margaret's sharp voice cut through the haze of Daniel's shock. "Sweetie, you can't just." But Emma only held on tighter, her small fingers digging into his palm. "You're supposed to take me home." Daniel staggered back, freeing his hand from hers. His breath came fast, uneven. Margaret's face twisted with concern. "Pastor Hayes, are you all right?" His mind reeled, trying to make sense of the impossible. Emma. That was her name. A name that suddenly felt too heavy. Who is she?" he croaked, his voice raw. Margaret hesitated, then sighed, her warm brown eyes clouding with something he couldn't quite place. "Emma's been with us for 8 months, she said carefully. "Her mother passed away." The words slammed into Daniel like a physical blow. His heart stuttered in his chest. "Her mother?" Margaret nodded, her voice quiet. "Sarah Brooks." Daniel barely heard the rest. Sarah, his daughter, gone. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, the walls closing in as Margaret continued speaking, unaware that every word she said was shattering him further. "No known relatives were contacted," she said. "Sarah had been sick for a while. By the time we got Emma, she was already alone." Daniel's vision blurred. His legs felt weak. Sarah, his baby girl. She had died. Alone. And now the only piece of her left in this world was standing before him, looking at him with those same desperate eyes he had turned away all those years ago. "Excuse me," Daniel choked out, pushing past Margaret. He stumbled out of the orphanage, the cold air hitting him like a slap. He braced himself against the hood of his truck, his body trembling. His chest ached with the weight of his past, with the guilt that had festered for years. He had failed Sarah. And now, standing in that orphanage, looking up at him with those hauntingly familiar eyes, was his second chance. But did he even deserve it? A lifetime too late. The orphanage's parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few rusted cars that belonged to staff members. Daniel gripped the edge of his truck's hood, his knuckles turning white against the cold metal. His breath came in uneven gasps, the world spinning around him in a dizzying blur. Sarah was gone. The words rattled inside his skull, refusing to settle, refusing to make sense. He had spent years convincing himself that maybe, just maybe, she was out there somewhere, living a good life, raising a family, finding happiness away from him. But the truth was far worse. She had died. Alone. And now her daughter, his granddaughter, was staring at him with the same desperate eyes Sarah had once had, pleading for something he had failed to give. "Please, adopt me." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. How could he even consider it? He had failed as a father. What made him think he could be anything more to Emma? The orphanage door creaked open behind him. "Pastor Hayes." Margaret's voice was gentle, but there was an edge of worry beneath it. He forced himself to stand straight, adjusting his collar even though the fabric suddenly felt suffocating. "I need a moment," he murmured. Margaret stepped beside him, her gaze studying him the way someone might examine a wounded animal. "I didn't realize you knew Sarah," she said carefully. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat, staring at the cracked pavement beneath his feet. "She was my daughter." Margaret inhaled sharply, understanding dawning in her eyes. "She never mentioned you." He let out a humorless chuckle. "That doesn't surprise me." Silence stretched between them. After a moment, Margaret spoke again, her voice softer. Emma doesn't know who you are. Daniel's chest tightened. I figured. Margaret hesitated. She's been struggling. Losing her mother was hard enough, but bouncing between foster homes hasn't helped. She has trouble trusting adults. I won't lie to you, Pastor Hayes. She's been waiting for someone to come back for her. Someone who never did. Daniel flinched. Margaret sighed, rubbing her hands together as the cool wind picked up around them. I don't know what happened between you and Sarah, and it's not my place to ask. But Emma is still here. She's still waiting. Daniel exhaled shakily, running a hand through his graying hair. He had spent years living with regret, years wishing for a second chance. Now it was staring him in the face, and he was terrified. What do I do? He asked quietly. Margaret gave him a sad smile. That's up to you. That night, Daniel sat in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of his past. The small wooden box sat on his desk, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. Inside were remnants of a life he had abandoned. Sarah's old drawings, crumpled birthday cards he had never sent, and at the very bottom, the last letter she had written to him. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper, the familiar ink smudged from where his fingers had traced over the words too many times. I'll raise my baby without you. A sharp pain shot through his chest. He had been so full of pride back then, so full of self-righteousness. A teenage pregnancy didn't fit the image of a respected pastor. A daughter who defied him was a problem to be cast out, not a soul to be saved. And now Sarah was gone, dead, and Emma was alone. He ran a hand down his face, his fingers pressing against his eyes. Could he really do this? Could he walk back into that orphanage, look that little girl in the eyes, and tell her he was ready to be the family she had lost? Would she even want him? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He frowned. It was nearly midnight. Rising from his chair, he made his way to the front door, hesitating before unlocking it. When he pulled it open, his breath caught. Emma stood on his doorstep. Her small frame was swallowed by an oversized hoodie, and she clutched a worn backpack in her hands, her fingers gripping the straps like a lifeline. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, but her expression was defiant. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Are you gonna send me away too?" Daniel felt something inside him crack. Slowly, he stepped aside, and for the first time in his life, he did what he should have done years ago. He let her in. A home of empty rooms. The silence inside the house was deafening. Emma stood just past the threshold, her small body stiff, her grip on her backpack unyielding. She wasn't looking at him, her gaze instead darting around the dimly lit entryway, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Daniel could see the hesitation in her stance, the way her feet shifted as if she were ready to bolt at any moment. Daniel closed the door behind her, locking out the cold night air. He didn't know what to say. His hands twitched at his sides, and he resisted the urge to reach for the Bible that always sat on his hallway table. A crutch, a shield. But there were no verses, no sermons that could prepare him for this. "Are you hungry?" he asked finally, his voice rough. Emma shook her head without looking at him. He nodded, though he had no idea what to do next. Every instinct told him to tread carefully, as if one wrong step would send her running back into the night. "Let me show you where you can sleep," he said instead. Emma hesitated but followed as he led her through the house. The old wooden floors creaked beneath their footsteps, the sound eerily loud in the stillness. Daniel had never realized how empty his home was until now. The house had been built for a family, a real family. It had once been filled with laughter, with warmth. Now it was just a hollow space, filled with memories that had long since faded. He pushed open the door to the guest room. This can be your room." The space was simple. The bed was neatly made with a faded blue quilt, the same one his wife had picked out years ago. The dresser was empty, save for a small lamp. There were no pictures on the walls. No signs of life. just another empty room in a house full of them. Emma lingered in the doorway, her grip tightening on the straps of her backpack. "It's temporary," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Daniel's chest ached. "You can stay as long as you need," he said gently. Emma didn't respond. Instead, she walked to the bed and sat on the edge of it, her movements slow and hesitant, as if she were waiting for someone to tell her to leave. Daniel swallowed hard. "I'll be down the hall if you need anything." She didn't acknowledge him. With a quiet sigh, he stepped back, closing the door partway, leaving just a sliver of light from the hallway to seep in. As he walked back to his study, his heart felt heavier than it had in years. Daniel sat at his desk long into the night. The adoption papers he had printed out were still untouched, the pages neatly stacked in front of him. He had read them over at least a dozen times, memorizing the requirements, the legal jargon. He knew this process wouldn't be easy. His past would work against him. His failure as a father would be scrutinized. The court would want proof that he could provide a stable home, that he wasn't the same man who had turned Sarah away. Could he? He let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. The thought of losing Emma, of failing her the way he had failed Sarah, made his stomach twist painfully. He couldn't let that happen. Not again. A soft noise from down the hall made him pause. A muffled sob. Emma. Daniel was on his feet before he could think. He moved quietly toward her room, pausing just outside the door. The sound of stifled crying broke something inside him. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, making a decision, he pushed the door open. Emma sat curled against the headboard, her small body wrapped in the quilt, her shoulders trembling. She wiped at her face quickly when she saw him, turning away as if ashamed. Daniel's heart clenched. He stepped inside slowly, careful not to startle her. "Emma." She didn't respond. Daniel glanced at the small nightstand beside the bed. A single picture frame sat there now, one she must have taken from her backpack. It was a photo of Sarah. His breath caught. Sarah looked young in the picture, younger than he remembered. She was smiling, her arms wrapped around a much smaller Emma. The love in her eyes was unmistakable. Daniel felt his throat tighten. "I miss her," Emma whispered. Daniel closed his eyes briefly before sitting down on the edge of the bed. "I miss her too," he admitted. Emma was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, she spoke again. "She used to sing to me when I had nightmares." Daniel swallowed hard, guilt pressing into his chest. "I wish I could have been there for her," he said quietly. Emma turned to look at him then, her brown eyes, Sarah's eyes, filled with so many unspoken emotions. For the first time, there was something in her gaze that wasn't just hurt. It was curiosity, like she was trying to see if he meant it. After a long moment, she shifted slightly, making space beside her. It wasn't an invitation. Not exactly. But it was something. A step forward. Daniel hesitated before leaning back slightly, resting against the headboard beside her. The silence between them stretched, and for the first time since Emma had walked through his door, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The cost of redemption. The morning air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee, mixing with the faint aroma of maple syrup. The small kitchen, which had been silent for years, now held the quiet presence of an unexpected guest. Daniel stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with a level of care he hadn't given to breakfast in years. The sizzling batter popped softly, and he adjusted the flame beneath the pan. He wasn't much of a cook, but pancakes seemed like the safest option. Simple, warm, familiar. Would she even eat them? A glance toward the dining table revealed Emma sitting stiffly, her small hands tucked into the sleeves of her oversized hoodie. She had come downstairs on her own that morning, her backpack clutched in her grip as if she expected to leave at any moment. She wasn't running. Not yet. But Daniel could see it in the way she avoided looking at him, in the way her shoulders tensed at every small movement. She was waiting for something. Waiting for him to tell her this was a mistake. That she couldn't stay. that she didn't belong. Daniel's stomach twisted painfully. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He carefully stacked the pancakes onto a plate, adding a generous drizzle of syrup before placing them in front of her. Emma stared at the plate. "I didn't ask for this," she mumbled, picking at the edge of the table. "I know," Daniel said simply, sitting down across from her. "But I figured it's a good way to start the day." She hesitated before picking up her fork, stabbing a pancake with just enough force to show her displeasure. Daniel pretended not to notice. He sipped his coffee, stealing glances at her over the rim of the mug. She wasn't eating much, just small bites, as if she didn't trust the food in front of her. Or maybe she didn't trust the man who had placed it there. Daniel set his cup down. "I was thinking we could stop by the bookstore today," he said, keeping his voice light. "Get some things for your room." Emma's fork paused midair. "I have books." "I know," he nodded. "But maybe we could pick out some new ones. Something you'd like." Emma studied him for a long moment before setting her fork down. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel blinked. "What do you mean?" She frowned slightly, her brown eyes searching his face for something he wasn't sure he had. "You don't even know me," she muttered. "And I don't know you. So why are you trying so hard?" The words were sharp, direct. Daniel exhaled slowly, setting his hands on the table. "You're right," he admitted. "We don't know each other yet, but that doesn't mean I don't care." Emma's jaw tightened. She pushed the plate away slightly. "That's what they all say." Daniel's stomach dropped. She was testing him, waiting to see if he would break, waiting for the moment he would decide she wasn't worth the effort. "Emma." He hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "I know you don't trust me. I don't blame you. But I'm not going anywhere." Emma scoffed, crossing her arms. "You say that now." Daniel's throat tightened. She had heard those words before, and whoever had said them had left. A deep, aching sadness settled in his chest. "I won't lie to you," he said softly. "I've made mistakes. Big ones. I wasn't there for your mom when she needed me, and I have to live with that every day. But I don't want to make that mistake again." Emma's fingers tightened around the sleeves of her hoodie. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, without a word, she stood up, dragging her backpack over her shoulder. "I have to get ready for school," she muttered before disappearing down the hall. The sound of her footsteps echoed long after she was gone. Daniel let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand down his face. She wasn't convinced. Not yet. But she hadn't walked away completely. That was something. The school parking lot was already bustling with activity when Daniel pulled up to the front entrance. Children ran across the pavement, their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders as they greeted friends and rushed inside. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her expression unreadable as she stared at the entrance. She hadn't spoken much during the drive. Daniel had tried to make small talk, asking about her favorite subjects, her teachers, if she had made any friends. But each question had been met with either a shrug or a quiet, "I don't know." Now she sat perfectly still, her fingers clutching the straps of her backpack tightly. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Do you want me to walk you in?" he asked. Emma shook her head quickly. "No." Her response was immediate, almost panicked. Daniel nodded, forcing himself to respect the boundary she was drawing. But something about the way she sat, shoulders hunched, fingers twitching against her backpack, made his stomach twist. "Emma." He hesitated. "Are you okay?" She stiffened. "Fine." A lie, but one she wasn't ready to admit. Daniel glanced toward the school entrance, watching as kids streamed inside. She was waiting. Not for him. For something else. Or someone. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Is someone bothering you?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Emma didn't move. Didn't answer. But she didn't have to. The way her hands clenched, the way her breath hitched slightly, it told him enough. Daniel's heart pounded. "Emma." "I can handle it," she muttered, reaching for the door handle. Daniel's stomach twisted. She had learned to deal with things on her own. No one had protected her before. She didn't expect him to do it now. But he wasn't going to let this go. "Emma," he said firmly. She froze. "If something's wrong, I need to know." For the first time, she turned to look at him. Her brown eyes were guarded, but there was something else there. Fear. Not of him. Of something she wasn't saying. "I told you," she said quietly. "I can handle it." Then, before he could say anything else, she pushed the door open and stepped out. Daniel watched as she disappeared into the crowd, his chest tight. Something was wrong. And no matter what it took, he was going to find out what. The burden she carried. Daniel sat in his truck long after Emma had disappeared into the school building. The parking lot slowly emptied, leaving only a few straggling parents saying their final goodbyes to their children. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. He had seen that look before. Sarah had worn that same guarded expression when she was younger, when she was hiding something, trying to bear the weight of her problems alone. It was a look that said, "No one is coming to help me, so I have to do this myself." And now Emma had inherited that same burden. The thought made Daniel's stomach turn. Something was wrong. And she wasn't going to tell him. Not yet. Not unless he proved that he wasn't going anywhere. With a slow breath, he pulled away from the school, the tires of his old truck crunching against the pavement as he merged onto the quiet suburban streets. He didn't go home. He wasn't sure he could sit in that empty house, staring at the walls, waiting for the clock to tick down until school ended. Instead, he drove straight to the one place he had always avoided. The cemetery. The old iron gates of Hillcrest Memorial Park stood solemn and unmoving, the paint peeling from the bars. It had been years since Daniel had been here. Too many years. He parked near the entrance, stepping out into the crisp morning air. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, their golden autumn leaves swaying in slow rhythmic movements. The sound of birds chirping was distant, almost muffled by the quiet stillness of the cemetery. His legs felt heavy as he walked. Row after row of headstones stretched before him, their engravings softened by time, names belonging to people whose stories had ended. Sarah's was among them. Daniel's throat tightened as he approached. The grave was simple. Sarah Brooks, beloved mother. 1989, 2023. No words of remembrance. No inscription of love. Because no one had been there to write them. Daniel fell to his knees, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. A lump formed in his throat, thick and unforgiving. He should have been here sooner. He should have been here when she needed him most. His vision blurred as he stared at the name, tracing the letters with trembling hands. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there." The wind carried his words away, offering no forgiveness. For years, he had convinced himself that there was nothing he could do to fix what had happened. That his absence from Sarah's life was something he would have to live with, something he would have to carry to his own grave. But now he had Emma. And he wasn't going to fail her too. Taking a shaky breath, Daniel pulled a small folded paper from his pocket. Emma's birth certificate, the one Margaret had given him when he first learned the truth. Her full name was printed in small, careful letters. Emma Grace Brooks, his granddaughter. His only connection to Sarah. His last chance to get this right. Daniel set the paper down at the base of the headstone. "I'll take care of her," he whispered. "I swear to you, I won't walk away again." He wasn't sure if Sarah would believe him, but he would spend the rest of his life proving it. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky by the time Daniel returned to the school. Children flooded out of the building in waves, their laughter ringing through the air as they ran to waiting parents and school buses. Daniel's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for Emma's familiar face. Then he saw her. She was standing near the fence, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder. She wasn't alone. A boy stood in front of her, taller than her, probably 13 or 14. His hands were stuffed into his jacket pockets, his posture relaxed, but there was something about the way he stood that made Daniel's blood run cold. Emma's expression was blank, carefully controlled, but her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. Daniel was out of the truck before he even realized what he was doing. He crossed the parking lot with long, purposeful strides, his pulse hammering in his ears. By the time he reached them, the boy had taken a step closer, and Emma still hadn't moved. Daniel's voice was calm, but firm. "Is there a problem here?" The boy glanced up, his gaze flickering over Daniel with little interest. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, blending into the crowd of students heading toward the buses. Emma didn't look at Daniel. Her hands were still curled into fists. "Emma," Daniel said, keeping his voice soft. "What was that about?" "Nothing." He let out a slow breath, keeping his frustration in check. "I don't believe that." Emma's jaw clenched, her shoulders tensing. But then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the truck. Daniel followed, his mind racing. Something was happening at school. Something she wasn't telling him. And if he was going to be the man she needed, he was going to have to find out what. The car ride home was silent. Emma sat curled up against the door, her arms wrapped around her knees, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Daniel kept glancing at her out of the corner of his eye, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. She was retreating again, slipping back behind those walls, and he couldn't let her. Not this time. "Emma," he said finally, his voice steady. She didn't respond. "Who was that boy?" She shifted slightly, turning her head just enough to give him a side glance. "No one." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "I can tell when someone's lying to me." Emma's lips pressed together, her fingers tightening around the sleeves of her hoodie. "I told you," she muttered. "I can handle it." The same words from that morning. The same words that had haunted him all day. Daniel took a deep breath, his hands loosening on the wheel. "I know you think that," he said, keeping his tone gentle. "And I know you've had to handle things on your own for a long time." Emma's fingers twitched. "But you don't have to do that anymore." Silence. Then, finally, Emma let out a breath. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They take things." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Who?" Emma's fingers gripped the edge of her hoodie tighter. "The older kids." Her voice was small, distant. "They take things from the younger ones. Lunch money, phones, anything they can." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Have they taken anything from you?" Emma hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached into her backpack. She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Daniel took it, his heart pounding as he unfolded it. Scrawled across the page in messy, ink-stained letters were 2 words. "You're next." Daniel felt his entire body go cold. He looked at Emma. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She just looked tired, like she had already accepted this as her reality. And Daniel Hayes, pastor, preacher, and lifelong failure, felt something he hadn't in a long, long time. Rage. He had failed Sarah, but he would not fail Emma. Not this time. Never again. The breaking point. The paper felt like sandpaper between Daniel's fingers. The scrawled, jagged letters, "You're next," burned into his mind, as if the ink had been branded onto his soul. His grip tightened, the paper crumpling in his fist, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Emma sat beside him in the truck, staring straight ahead, her face unreadable. But the way her hands gripped her sleeves told him everything he needed to know. She had been expecting this. She had been living with this. And she had said nothing because she thought no one would care. A slow, simmering rage built inside Daniel's chest, a kind of anger he hadn't felt in years, not since the day Sarah had walked out of his house for the last time, her eyes red with tears, her voice shaking as she had whispered, "I don't need you anymore." This time, he wasn't going to stand by and let someone he loved suffer. This time, he wasn't going to walk away. Daniel forced himself to take a steady breath, unclenching his fist so he wouldn't accidentally tear the note in half. He placed it gently on the dashboard, smoothing out the wrinkles. "Emma," he said carefully, his voice level but firm. "How long has this been happening?" She didn't answer at first. Her fingers continued to twist the fabric of her hoodie, pulling it over her knuckles like a shield. "Emma," he repeated, softer this time. She exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly. "A few months." Daniel's jaw tightened. He turned slightly in his seat, angling himself toward her. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Emma scoffed, though it lacked any real humor. "Who would I tell?" He didn't need to ask what she meant. No one had ever been there for her before. Why would she believe anyone would be now? Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, willing himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to let anger cloud his judgment. Not now. Not when she was finally opening up. "Emma, I need you to tell me everything," he said. "Who are they? Have they hurt you?" Emma hesitated. Then, finally, she spoke. "It's mostly older kids. 8th graders. A few 9th graders, when they bother showing up. They take stuff. Push people around. If you don't give them what they want, they make your life hell." Daniel inhaled sharply, his hands tightening into fists. "Have they?" "They haven't hit me," Emma cut in quickly. "Not yet. Not yet." That phrase sent ice through Daniel's veins. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He needed to do something. He needed to fix this. But how? If he had learned anything as a pastor, it was that broken systems rarely favored the victims. Would the school do anything? Would they even listen? Or would they dismiss Emma the way so many others had? He couldn't risk that. He had to make them listen. And if they wouldn't, then Daniel Hayes would remind them why he had once been a man people feared. By the time they pulled into the driveway, Emma had retreated back into silence. She mumbled something about homework before disappearing up the stairs to her room. Daniel sat in the truck, gripping the steering wheel, staring blankly ahead. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the front yard. He needed a plan. Emma was under his roof now, which meant her safety was his responsibility, and he would protect her, even if it meant going to war with an entire school district. With renewed determination, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. David Carter. The lawyer answered on the second ring. "Pastor Hayes, I wasn't expecting to hear from you this late. I need your help," Daniel said without preamble. "It's about Emma." A pause. "What happened?" Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She's being harassed at school. Threatened. Maybe worse, and I have a feeling the school isn't going to do much about it." David sighed on the other end of the line. "You're probably right. Schools like to pretend these things don't happen until they get caught in a lawsuit." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "Then I need to make sure they take this seriously." David was silent for a moment. Then, "I'll look into it. But if this goes to the administration, it's going to be a fight. Are you ready for that?" Daniel glanced up at the house, at the dim light glowing from Emma's bedroom window. "I'm ready," he said. Dinner was quiet. Emma barely touched her food. Her shoulders hunched as she pushed rice around her plate with a fork. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Daniel watched her carefully, trying to find the right words, the right way to reach her. Finally, he set his fork down. "I called a lawyer today." Emma's head snapped up, her eyes widening. "What? Why?" "Because if the school won't do anything about those kids, I will." Emma stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she shook her head. "You can't." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And why not?" Emma's hands curled into fists in her lap. "Because it'll just make things worse." "Emma." "No." Her voice was sharp, more forceful than he had ever heard it. "You don't get it. If you make trouble, they'll find out it was me. And then..." She exhaled harshly, pushing her plate away. "I can handle it, okay?" Daniel's throat tightened. Emma, you shouldn't have to handle it. She looked away. Yeah, well, that's just how it is. No, it wasn't. It was how it had been, but it wasn't how it was going to stay. Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. Emma, listen to me. No one gets to treat you like this. You have me now, and I will fight for you, whether you believe it or not. Emma swallowed hard, her expression flickering, just for a moment, before she masked it again. Then, without another word, she stood up and left the table. Daniel let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. This was going to be harder than he thought. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the wooden floors. He turned onto his side, exhaling slowly. He hadn't felt this restless in years. The image of Emma's face, her guarded expression, her downcast eyes, lingered in his mind. She didn't trust him. Not yet. And he didn't blame her. Trust wasn't built with words. It was built with actions. And tomorrow, he would show her that he meant every single one of his. The next morning, Daniel was at the school before the first bell rang. He marched through the front doors, his presence radiating authority in a way it hadn't in years. The receptionist glanced up, startled by his determined expression. Pastor Hayes, she asked hesitantly. I need to speak to the principal, Daniel said, his voice even. Now. The receptionist faltered. Do you have an appointment? Daniel's jaw tightened. No, but I suggest you make one. The woman hesitated, then nodded quickly, grabbing the phone. Daniel stood there, his heart pounding, his mind focused on one thing. Emma. She thought no one would fight for her. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. A battle worth fighting. The school's front office smelled of freshly printed paper and old coffee, the sharp tang of disinfectant lingering in the air. A row of plastic chairs lined the wall, and Daniel took the only available seat, his hands clasped together in his lap, his expression unreadable. The receptionist's fingers flew over the keyboard as she whispered into the phone, glancing at him every few seconds, as if expecting him to lose his patience. He wouldn't. Daniel Hayes had spent most of his life mastering the art of patience. He had waited years for forgiveness he knew he would never get. He had waited a lifetime to right the wrongs that had stolen his daughter from him. But this wasn't about patience. This was about justice. The principal's door opened with a soft click, and a woman in a navy blue blazer stepped out. She was in her mid-40s, her short, neatly styled blonde hair framing a face lined with polite exhaustion. She adjusted her glasses before offering him a carefully measured smile. Pastor Hayes, she greeted. I wasn't expecting you this morning. Daniel stood, shaking her hand with a firm grip. I wasn't expecting to be here, either. She gestured for him to follow her inside. The office was neat, though impersonal. A large desk sat at the center of the room, the surface free of clutter except for a single stack of files and a small plant in a ceramic pot. Diplomas and framed certificates hung on the wall behind her, their glass gleaming in the morning light filtering through the window. Principal Catherine Dawson took her seat, folding her hands on the desk. Please, sit. Daniel did. She exhaled slowly. What can I do for you, Pastor? He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I'm here about my granddaughter, Emma Brooks. Catherine's expression didn't change, but he didn't miss the slight tension in her shoulders. I see. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out the crumpled note Emma had received. He flattened it on her desk with careful precision, then slid it toward her. She adjusted her glasses and read the words, her lips pressed into a thin line. Where did you find this? Emma's backpack, Daniel said evenly. She's been getting threats. She's been bullied for months, and from what I understand, this has been going on with other students as well. Principal Dawson set the note down, exhaling through her nose. I appreciate your concern, Pastor, But we have procedures for handling situations like this. Then why hasn't it been handled? The question landed like a stone, heavy and immovable. Catherine's expression faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "We do our best," she said, her tone measured. "But bullying is complicated. We can't take disciplinary action without sufficient evidence." Daniel let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "You have evidence. It's sitting right in front of you. Anonymous threats are difficult to trace." "Emma told me who's been bothering her." Catherine stilled. Daniel's voice remained steady, but there was no mistaking the fire beneath it. "I don't want words. I don't want empty reassurances. I want action. I want to know what you're going to do to protect my granddaughter." Catherine sighed, rubbing her temple. "I'll need to speak with the school counselor and Emma's teachers. If there's a pattern, we'll take appropriate steps." "That's not good enough." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, startled by the iron in his voice. "Emma is scared," Daniel continued. "She's learned to expect that no one will stand up for her, and judging by the fact that this has been happening for months, I'd say she's not wrong." Catherine swallowed, clearly choosing her next words carefully. "I understand that you're frustrated." "No," Daniel said. "You don't." Silence settled over the room. Catherine Dawson was an experienced administrator. She had dealt with angry parents before. She had likely dealt with pastors before. But Daniel wasn't just a pastor. He was a man who had lost his daughter. And he wasn't about to lose his granddaughter, too. After a long moment, she sighed. "I'll set up a meeting with the parents of the students involved. We'll start an investigation." Daniel's jaw clenched. "And if nothing changes?" Catherine hesitated. Daniel leaned forward. "Then I'll take this to the district." Her eyes widened slightly. "I'll bring in a lawyer," Daniel added. "And I'll make sure every news outlet in town knows that this school ignored a child's cry for help." Catherine's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. It was a bluff. Or at least, it had been. But now, sitting here, Daniel realized that if it came down to it, if the school refused to protect Emma, he would go to war for her. He had failed Sarah. He would not fail Emma. Principal Dawson must have seen it in his eyes because she nodded. "I'll handle it personally." Daniel held her gaze. "Good." The drive home was quiet. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind still racing. He should have felt relief. He had forced the school's hand. He had made them take action. But there was still a gnawing feeling in his gut. Emma didn't trust him yet. She still believed that standing up would only make things worse, and if he was being honest with himself, he was afraid she might be right. But he wasn't going to let fear stop him. Not again. When Emma came home that afternoon, she walked in slowly, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She set it down near the door and glanced at him warily. "You went to the school." It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. "I did." Emma exhaled sharply, dropping onto the couch. "Great. Now they're going to know I told." "Good." Emma's head snapped up, eyes wide. "What?" Daniel sat down across from her, folding his hands together. "Emma, bullies thrive in silence. They want you to believe that if you speak up, things will get worse." Emma's fingers curled into her hoodie sleeves. "And they do." Daniel shook his head. "Not if someone fights back." Emma scoffed. "And who's gonna fight them? You?" "Yes." She blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady. "You don't have to handle this alone anymore. You have me now." Emma looked away, her jaw tight. "They'll still come after me." Daniel's expression darkened. "No, they won't." Emma frowned. "You can't promise that." Daniel let out a slow breath. "You're right. I can't promise they won't try. But I can promise that the next time they do, they won't get away with it." Emma stared at him for a long moment. And then, finally, she let out a breath. It wasn't relief. Not yet. But it was something. A crack in the wall between them. Daniel would take it. That night, as he sat in his study, staring at the adoption papers on his desk, he realized something. This wasn't just about Emma's safety. It was about proving to her, proving to himself, that he was worthy of being in her life. He reached for a pen, and with a steady hand, he signed his name. A legal battle might be ahead, but he was ready. For Emma, for Sarah, for the second chance he had never deserved. The choice that changes everything. The courtroom was colder than Daniel had expected. The heavy wooden doors had shut behind him with an eerie finality, the polished floor reflecting the light from the tall windows along the wall. The scent of old paper, leather-bound law books, and decades of bureaucracy filled the space. This was it, the moment where he would either win the right to raise Emma as his own, or walk out of here with nothing. Daniel stood at the defendant's table, his fingers pressed against the smooth grain of the oak, trying to steady himself. His lawyer, David Carter, was seated beside him, adjusting his tie as he prepared his argument. Across the room sat Linda Hewitt, Emma's court-appointed caseworker. A woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze, she had been evaluating his ability to care for Emma ever since he had filed for adoption. And she wasn't convinced. Daniel could feel the weight of her scrutiny as she shuffled her papers, her lips pursed in thought. He glanced at the small figure sitting quietly at the other table. Emma. She looked so small in the oversized courtroom chair, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed downward. She hadn't said a word since they arrived, her body language withdrawn, guarded. Daniel's chest tightened. She didn't believe this would work. Not yet. And honestly, neither did he. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and keen eyes, settled into her chair, adjusting her glasses as she looked over the case files. "Let's begin," her voice rang out, steady and authoritative. "Pastor Hayes, you are petitioning for full legal custody of Emma Grace Brooks. Is that correct?" Daniel stood, his voice firm. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "And the Department of Child Services has expressed concerns regarding your history. Miss Hewitt, you may present your findings." Daniel braced himself. Linda Hewitt stood, her heels clicking against the floor as she moved to the center of the room. "Your Honor," she began, glancing briefly at Daniel before returning her focus to the judge. "While there is no doubt that Pastor Hayes has taken steps to improve his relationship with Emma, the fact remains that he has a history of parental abandonment." Daniel's fingers curled into fists at his sides. 23 years ago, Linda continued, he turned his pregnant 16-year-old daughter away, refusing her support when she needed it most. That choice resulted in her struggling alone, leading to years of hardship and, ultimately, her untimely death. Now, Pastor Hayes wishes to raise her child, despite having had no prior relationship with her. Daniel's stomach clenched. Linda turned to face him directly. "Pastor, you weren't there for Sarah when she needed you. What makes us believe you won't fail Emma the same way?" Silence settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. Daniel forced himself to meet her gaze. For years, he had been trying to outrun the weight of his mistakes. Not anymore. He stepped forward, his voice steady, unwavering. "Miss Hewitt, you're right." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "I failed Sarah," Daniel admitted, his voice raw with truth. "I failed her in ways I can never undo. I can't change the past. I can't erase my mistakes." He turned, looking directly at the judge. "But what I can do is not make them again." The judge studied him carefully. Daniel swallowed, glancing toward Emma, who was staring at him now, her expression unreadable. "I don't expect this court to ignore my past. I don't expect Emma to trust me just because I showed up now." His voice wavered slightly, but he kept going. "But I am here, and I will continue to be here, no matter how long it takes for her to believe that." He took a breath, steadying himself. "My daughter died thinking I didn't love her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't go back and tell her she was wrong. But I can show her daughter that she isn't alone." The judge leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. Miss Hewitt, she said, shifting her attention to the caseworker, does Emma have any objections to this adoption? Linda turned, her gaze falling on the small girl sitting quietly at the table. Emma. Daniel held his breath. Emma sat motionless for a long moment. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. I don't know, she said quietly. Daniel's heart ached. She had been hurt too many times. Lied to. Let down. Why should she believe he was any different? The judge nodded. That's understandable. But Emma, do you want to stay where you are now? Emma hesitated, shifting slightly in her seat. Then, finally, she spoke. I don't want to go somewhere else. The words weren't a declaration of love, but they were enough. The judge glanced at Linda, then at David. Finally, she sighed, adjusting her glasses. Pastor Hayes, I'll be honest with you. This is a difficult case. You've demonstrated commitment, but commitment alone doesn't make a parent. Daniel's heart pounded. However, the judge continued, I believe that Emma deserves stability. And if this court denies your petition, she will likely be placed in another foster home, which may cause more disruption in her life. She exhaled slowly. I'm willing to grant a temporary 6-month guardianship. After that, the court will reassess. Daniel exhaled sharply, barely daring to believe it. 6 months. A chance. The judge turned to Emma. Emma, this means you'll stay with Pastor Hayes for now. You'll have time to decide if this is what you want. Is that okay? Emma nodded slightly. The judge picked up her gavel. Then it settled. The gavel hit the desk with a sharp crack, sealing Daniel's fate. The ride home was silent. Emma stared out the window, her face unreadable. Daniel kept his hand steady on the wheel, his mind still reeling from the ruling. He had 6 months. 6 months to prove himself. 6 months to make her believe that he was the family she had been searching for. As they pulled into the driveway, Emma finally spoke. What if I don't want to stay after 6 months? Daniel put the truck in park, glancing at her. Then I'll take you wherever you want to go, he said honestly. Emma studied him, as if trying to detect a lie. But she didn't find one. With a small nod, she grabbed her backpack and climbed out of the truck, heading toward the house. Daniel watched her go, his heart heavy but hopeful. 6 months. It wasn't forever. But maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. And for the first time in a long time, he believed that redemption was possible. The home she never had. The house felt different now. As Emma walked inside, her small frame carrying the weight of everything that had happened today, Daniel followed a few steps behind, feeling something inside of him shift. The house that had once been nothing more than walls and silence suddenly carried something new. Hope. For the first time in years, it wasn't just a house. It was hers. It was theirs. Daniel set his keys on the table near the door, watching as Emma toed off her worn sneakers. She hesitated before looking up at him, uncertainty flickering across her face. I don't know what to do now, she admitted quietly. Daniel's throat tightened. She had never had a home before. Never had a place where she was sure she belonged. And now that she was here, now that a judge had ruled she would stay, she didn't know what came next. So Daniel did the only thing that made sense. He smiled. Well, he said, keeping his voice light, normally, people who live in a house together eat dinner. And after the day we just had, I'd say we deserve something good. Emma blinked. Like what? Daniel scratched his chin in thought. I was thinking spaghetti. Or, well, I could try to make lasagna, but I can't guarantee it won't be a disaster. A tiny smirk tugged at the corner of Emma's mouth. You can't cook, can you? Daniel chuckled. Not very well. No. Emma rolled her eyes, but the tension in her shoulders eased. Just a little. I can help, she mumbled. Daniel nodded. I'd like that. It was a small thing, really, cooking dinner together. But it was the kind of small thing that built families. So when Emma hesitantly followed him into the kitchen, and they began gathering ingredients, Daniel felt something warm settle in his chest. They ate at the table. Not in separate rooms. Not in silence. Together. Emma wasn't the most talkative person, but she asked him a few questions. How long had he lived in the house? Did he always wear a suit? Why did old people drink so much coffee? Daniel answered each one with as much patience as he could, and for the first time, he realized something. She was curious about him. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to care. Later that night, as Emma climbed the stairs to her room, she paused halfway up. She hesitated before glancing over her shoulder. Hey, she shifted uncomfortably. Are you gonna be here tomorrow morning? The question hit Daniel harder than anything else she could have said. She had lived her entire life expecting people to leave. And now, even after everything, she still wasn't sure if he would stay. Daniel met her gaze, steady and certain. I'll be here, Emma. She swallowed, nodding once before disappearing down the hall. Daniel exhaled slowly. She didn't trust him yet. Not completely. But she was giving him a chance. And that was enough. 6 months later, the morning sun spilled golden light through the windows, painting the kitchen in soft warmth. Daniel stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with a kind of ease that had come from months of practice. Behind him, he heard the familiar shuffle of small feet on the wooden floor. Emma yawned as she plopped into her usual chair at the kitchen table, her hair a mess from sleep, her oversized hoodie swallowing her frame. Morning, she muttered, rubbing her eyes. Daniel slid a plate of pancakes in front of her, offering a playful smirk. Morning. You're up early. Emma shrugged, grabbing the syrup bottle. Didn't want you burning breakfast. Daniel chuckled. It had become their routine. Their normal. After 6 months, the house wasn't just his anymore. It was hers too. Her drawings were pinned to the fridge. Her shoes were always left haphazardly near the front door. A chessboard sat half-finished on the coffee table, waiting for their next match. The house had changed. Because Emma had changed it. And so had he. A knock on the door interrupted breakfast. Daniel wiped his hands on a kitchen towel before heading to the front door. When he opened it, he found David Carter standing there, a manila folder tucked under one arm. Daniel's chest tightened. This was it. The decision. David smiled slightly. Mind if I come in? Daniel stepped aside, his heartbeat quickening as David entered the living room, setting the folder on the coffee table. Emma peeked over from the kitchen, curiosity flashing in her eyes. What's going on? David gestured toward the folder. The judge gave her final ruling this morning. Daniel felt his breath hitch, and David smiled. The adoption is official. Silence stretched across the room. Emma stared. Daniel felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. It was over. It was real. Emma wasn't a temporary guest anymore. She was his daughter. Forever. Emma shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the hem of her hoodie. So that means I have to stay with you. Daniel swallowed. It means you get to stay with me. Emma bit her lip, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long moment, she let out a small, shaky breath. Okay. Daniel exhaled. She didn't say thank you. She didn't run to hug him. She didn't cry. But she stayed. And that was enough. That night, Daniel found Emma's bedroom door slightly ajar. Inside, she was curled up on her bed, staring at an old photo she had been keeping in her nightstand. A picture of Sarah. Daniel's heart clenched as he leaned against the doorway. She would have been proud of you, he said softly. Emma didn't look up. Would she? Daniel stepped forward, kneeling beside the bed. Yes. Emma hesitated, then turned the photo toward him. It was an old one, Sarah as a teenager, holding a much younger Emma in her arms. She talked about you, Emma murmured. Sometimes. Daniel swallowed past the lump in his throat. I wish I had been there for her. Emma was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, she whispered, I'm glad you're here now. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in those words. When he opened them again, he found Emma watching him carefully, as if measuring his reaction. He reached out, hesitating only briefly before gently pulling her into a hug. She stiffened. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she hugged him back. Daniel felt his heart swell, his arms tightening around her just slightly. Not too much. Not too fast. Just enough to let her know he wasn't going anywhere. Epilogue. 1 year later, Daniel sat in the audience of Emma's middle school auditorium, his heart pounding as he watched her step onto the stage. She clutched a small paper in her hands, her fingers twitching slightly, but her expression was determined. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and began speaking. Her speech was about second chances, about trust, about finding a family where you least expected it. And when she was done, when the applause filled the auditorium, and she stepped off the stage, she walked straight toward him. Not away, not uncertain, but toward him. And this time, when she hugged him, it wasn't hesitant at all.